Yeah, so, well, I mean, just as a minor point, strictly speaking, I guess, I'm not even sure it's the case that um, the contingency argument actually entails that God is a first cause, um, because it doesn't actually affirm a causal principle. It just affirms, it just requires that there's an explanation for all contingent facts. So I suppose in principle, it's possible that a proponent of the argument could say that um, God is the explanation for the universe without necessarily being the cause of it. But, obviously most people who would be running the argument are going to think that God is the cause, and that's how he's the explanation. So that's just sort of like a minor technical point. Nothing important turns on it. We can just sort of assume, for the sake of argument, that how some necessary fact or being explains a contingent universe is through causation, through causing it to come into being. But now, well, I think there's a number of issues with the argument. I think that if the PSR is understood in the strong sense, thank you, meaning that every contingent fact that's not, every fact that's not explained by some other contingent fact must be necessary, something like that. I think that to hold that view would make the contingency argument impossible, because there could be no contingent facts on that view. And the reason why would be something like this. So let's imagine like the first contingent fact, right? Which might be like God. Maybe it's like God creation of the universe or something like that. So, thing is, we could ask the question, in virtue of what is that fact explained? Which is to say something like, why is it that there's a universe rather than no universe? Or why is it that there's this universe rather than some other universe, right? And that's going to be cashed out in terms of some desire of God's, right? But there's going to be a question then, is that desire essential fact about God, which is to say, is it necessary, or is it itself a contingent fact, right? Now, if it's an essential fact and therefore a necessary fact about God, that he has this desire to create our universe, right, then that just means, given that God is taken to be necessary, which means he exists in every possible world, in every possible world that he exists, he has all his essential properties. And so if this desire is one of those properties, right, and the desire is what explains the existence of the universe, then it's just going to be the case that in every possible world, the universe will be created, because the desire to create will exist in every possible world, right? And so the universe would turn out to be necessary because it exists in every possible world. So if the universe is necessary, then it's not contingent. And then there's no contingency argument from the fact of a contingent universe to a necessary being, right? So what would be entailed would be necessitarianism, the view that all facts are necessary. Now, you could say, well, what if they take the other horn and say the desire is contingent, right? But then we'd need an explanation for that fact, right? And so either a necessary fact or a contingent fact could explain it, right? Well, if it's a contingent fact, then there's just going to be a question as to what explains that fact. And unless it bottoms out in a necessary fact, there'll be an infinite regress. And I guess the way that they usually like to deal with infinite regress, proponents of the argument, the way that they usually like to deal with infinite regresses, I think, is to say, well, if what explains why that infinite chain of contingent facts holds rather than some other chain of contingent explanations, some other infinite chain of contingent explanations. So that's not an option, or at least the proponent of the argument is going to claim that that's not an option, right? And so, in fact, it has to be some necessary fact. But we saw that if the fact was necessary, then that would mean that it would entail that which it necessitates, right? Which is to say, whatever it is that it's explaining will hold in every possible world, and that will be true of all facts. And so necessitarianism, which is the view that there's only one possible world and that all facts are necessary, right, will hold. So what's called the strong PSR entails necessitarianism. And so the contingency argument can't even get off the ground if the strong PSR is assumed, because it undermines the contingency argument. So, for one thing, I think it's crazy to accept necessitarianism. In fact, I don't even really think it's coherent. But the point is, I mean, even if you thought that necessitarianism was coherent, it's hard to see why anybody would accept it. I mean, there are a handful of philosophers today, maybe about a half dozen, and maybe there are another dozen in the history of thought. I mean, I have a list that I've made. It's always been a strong minority view, like a very small minority of philosophers have ever held it.
The rest are cowards.
So yeah, I mean, you could have an argument for necessitarianism. There are philosophers who argue for that, and that would be a different set of issues, right? But if we're just talking about the contingency argument, right, which presupposes a PSR, if the PSR being presupposes a strong PSR, most people are just going to say, including theists, right, including people who would want to run the argument, they're going to say that consequence is too extreme, to be committed to necessitarianism.
Could you quickly summarize how you get to necessitarianism again?
Yeah, so the idea is take the first contingent fact, right, and presumably some necessary fact is supposed to explain it. Well, in virtue of what does that necessary fact explain the contingent fact? It's in virtue of some feature of that necessary entity, let's say. Some feature of that necessary entity, let's say a desire, right? And that desire could either be an essential property of the being, which is taken to be, the being is taken to be necessary. So the being exists in all possible world, right? But but the properties that that being has are going to consist in some essential properties, right? The essential properties are the properties that hold, that any world that the being exists in, it will have those properties. Those are the essential properties. Now, most people want to say, in addition to the essential properties, there could be accidental ones, right? Accidental ones will only hold in some worlds where that being exists, and those will be contingent properties of the being, right? So if we're talking about something like a desire, the desire is either going to be an essential property of that being, let's say God, or an accidental property of that being, in which case it's contingent. Well, if it's essential and therefore necessary, the desire will hold in every possible world, right? And it'll follow then that the facts that that desire explains will be entailed and will hold in every possible world, right?
All right.
If it's an accidental property, right, it's contingent, and then we have to ask, well, what explains why at this world this contingent fact holds rather than some other contingent fact? And that's going to lead to an infinite regress of contingent facts, unless, right, which will either, I mean, either it will not, either the regress will be arrested by some necessary fact, right? In which case we'll be back on the first horn of the dilemma, which is that what is being explained will be entailed and therefore necessary. Or alternatively, you'll have an infinite regress of contingent explanations. But then again, the proponent of the PSR is going, and this argument is going to say, well, what explains why that infinite chain of contingent facts, of contingent explanations holds rather than some infinite chain of contingent, some other infinite chain of contingent explanations? And again, you're either going to, it's going to have to bottom out somewhere in a necessary fact in order to fulfill the demand of this strong PSR. But with the strong PSR in place, the necessary fact will always entail what it explains, and that's just going to mean that whatever it is that it explains will be necessary, because it will be brought about by that being in every possible world. So you can't have a PSR you can't have a contingency argument if you have a strong PSR. The two are logically incompatible. Now this has been to some extent recognized by proponents of the argument. They understand, or many of them now understand and agree, that a strong PSR entails necessitarianism, and that's generally taken to be an unacceptable consequence. Okay, thank you. So what they've instead tried to do is propose some weaker version of the PSR, right? So they'll say things like, I don't know, like all entities. I'm trying to remember how they formulate these things, but like something like all entities are explained by some other fact, unless they are necessary. But it's not true that all events are explained by some other fact. We could do better, I think. So all events, which are the ones that you want? But not all events are explained because they want to say that like libertarian free choices would be examples of. Oh, they sold them. Yeah, that's probably decent. So they'll say that contingent. They want to say they'll say something like a libertarian free choice is not explained by some further fact. And so then they'll say, given that PSR or some other sort of weakened form of the PSR, which admits basically some brute contingencies, you can still derive. Was this one of them? You could still derive. You could still infer to a necessary being. You just would be admitting some brute contingent facts, right? So yeah, you could have a PSR like that. But then the question is going to be, well, why would somebody accept that PSR, right? Because it just seems like you can construct a PSR however you want in order to get the conclusion of the argument. But sometimes what they're accused of is a taxicab fallacy, which is to say, they think that this robust principle holds, except where it doesn't, right?
The relationship between the first contingent fact and, are you calling it the first necessary, like in your analogy of the desire and God?
Well, yeah, well, it's not, presumably if God is the creator, right, if the universe is contingent and God, a necessary being, explains, that's all right. Yeah, that's wild. And God explains the existence of the universe. Presumably it's in virtue of some desire he has, right? Because it's understood, well, I mean, unless around here people take all kinds of crazy views, right? Like that God is not an agent, But if you just put aside crazy views like God is not an agent, right? Or he's not a mind or whatever, right? Normally we're going to understand the claim that God is a creator, right, as some kind of agential claim, right? God is an agent. And on an ordinary, on a standard kind of account of what an agent is, right, or a standard analysis of what agency is, you're going to understand that actions as opposed to mere behaviors, right? Behaviors are what mechanisms do, right? Or what patients as opposed to agents do, right? If we're talking about an agent as opposed to a mere mechanism, it's going to be able to act rather than merely behave, right? And that's going to be something that's understood to be rationalized. An action is understood to be rationalized by beliefs and desires, right? So it's going to be some set of beliefs and desires which fundamentally explain why there is a universe, right? Why God creates a universe, right? So the question is going to be those intentional states, beliefs and desires, right? What explains why it has those beliefs and desires rather than some other set of beliefs and desires, right? And so the point is, if those are necessary, if those beliefs and desires are necessary, then the same action is going to be rationalized in every possible world, right? Which is to say that this universe will be created.
Yeah,
but if
I
those
get
are
that.
contingent facts, some further fact has to explain why those beliefs and desires hold at this world.
But isn't
Right?
this a coupling of the contingency argument with the God argument? Like, they're not necessarily the same.
Oh, no. You could, yeah, one other issue with contingency arguments is it's something called I think it's called the gap problem, which is that even if the contingency argument were successful, it's not really clear how you get to a personal being, right?
Yeah,
It could just be that you get to a necessary fact, right? So there could be an
Right.
atheistic contingency argument. I'm just saying that the same problem is going to hold whether it's a personal being or not, because necessary facts can't explain contingent facts because they entail the facts that they explain. And so if a necessary fact entails the fact that it explains, that just means that that which it is explaining will be necessary because it'll hold at every possible world, right?
I
So,
wish I understood that. I can't
Oh,
get my
well,
head
look,
around that.
let's
look.
just imagine it's not a
Necessary
personal.
facts explain only other necessary facts.
Look, let's think about it as if it weren't a mind, and it was just
Please.
some other necessary type of fact, right?
Christians have made the
Well,
conversation delusional. Yeah, please.
presumably we're still talking about, let's say, some kind of causal explanation, right? Well, so something explains why given some antecedent condition, some effect will follow, right? And that's presumably going to be something like a combination of like laws and sort of the initial conditions, let's say, right? So if you have a set of initial conditions, if you have a specific set of initial conditions and a specific set of laws, then it's going to follow that given those conditions and given those laws, it's going to follow that some effect will occur,
Right.
right? All else equal, right? So again, either those facts, what laws hold and what initial condition holds, are necessary, right? Or they're contingent. Now, if they're contingent, then some further fact has to explain those, right? And you're just going to get this problem where eventually it has to bottom out in a necessary fact. But if it's a necessary fact, right, and those laws hold and those initial conditions hold, then that will just determine some outcome. Now, what if somebody says, "Oh, but wait a minute, there's some indeterminism at play. Why should we assume that the laws and the initial conditions have to entail some outcome? Why couldn't it be that there's a range of different possible outcomes that are constrained by that set of initial conditions and those laws, right? But that doesn't actually determine the outcome, right? It'll limit the range of outcomes that could be instantiated, right? But it won't determine which outcome occurs. Well, if there's indeterminism there, you're just talking about a contingent fact, right? And then you're just giving up on the PSR, but because the PSR says every fact, right? Sorry, if there's indeterminism, it's a brute contingent fact, and you're giving up on the PSR, right? Because the PSR, the strong PSR, is incompatible with there being any brute contingencies. But if there's indeterminism there, then you're just giving up on there being a complete explanation for all.
And indeterminism in
events.
this case is necessary facts don't necessarily lead to singular
like
outcomes, but a group of.
Yeah, like a non-entailing explanation, right? Sometimes proponents of this argument want to say, well, not all explanations are entailing. Well, that's just giving up on the strong PSR, right? They're just admitting some brute contingency into their picture, and then they just relabel it, right? They find a word. This is like a game that philosophers, well, people I consider bad philosophers play, right? Where they just, or maybe they're not bad philosophers in every respect, right? But I consider this to be like an illicit move. They just sort of relabel things, you know. So somehow the absence of an explanation becomes an explanation, right? But the point is, there's some fact which is unexplained, which is why, in this instance, A rather than B obtained. So we might have a full explanation for why either of those two disjuncts obtain, but we don't have an explanation for why one rather than the other at this world is the one which is instantiated.
I see, I see.
And
And that
so they're just giving up
explanation
on
would
the
be
strong PSR.
necessary.
Yeah, if there were an explanation for that fact, right, then
Uh,
there'd be an entailment.
I see, I
In
see.
which
Okay.
case the event would be necessitated.
I want to just
So this,
interrupt for a special announcement
yeah.
real quick. I have found an opponent for Delano.
Okay. Who is it?
Gavin. He's willing to come in right now and
Oh,
debate
come
Delano.
on.
Jesus Christ! Hold on, hold on,
Okay,
Ray. Did you
but
did you
just
digest all
one
of?
second.
What's that?
Cool.
Shut up, Matt.
I don't think Gavin, I mean,
Gavin said, yes, sir, he's ready to debate Delano.
Okay, but just one moment. From my understanding of necessitarianism, it leads to some sort of like modal collapse, right?
That's right. Yeah, I'm saying that
Yeah,
if the strong PSR holds, it will entail modal collapse. And
and
so that's just the consequence. Few people are going to accept, even most proponents of the argument, right? They don't
right.
want to commit to necessitarianism. There's a handful of people who think that we should all be necessitarians, right? So they have an independent set of arguments that they will run to try to show that we're rationally compelled to accept the strong PSR, right? Of course, that's giving up on the contingency argument. That's going to entail that all facts are necessary, so there's no contingency argument. So that would be a different set of issues. Why is it that we shouldn't be necessitarians? But what people who still want to run the argument will do is just say, well, we're not proposing a strong PSR. We're saying there has to be a weak PSR. And I think there are various formulations for what the weak PSR is supposed to be, right? And you can still infer to a necessary being, right? Basically what they're doing is trying to find a way to have a PSR that's non-entailing. And so if you have a PSR that's non-entailing, you could still have, presumably, some kind of successful contingency argument, which would infer to a necessary being, right? But like one issue there is going to be, well, why would we accept this weakened PSR, right?
Like it's the taxi cab, and that
Yeah, it's kind of like,
it
well,
applies
okay,
when it
yeah,
does, but it doesn't when it
yeah, it
doesn't.
applies when it does, and yeah, I mean, it's kind of like,
Right.
so why would I, like, take libertarian free will, right? Like they'll say, oh yeah, all facts. Where are you going? Oh, what time is it? Well, let's see if we can get the tickets first. Why would, yeah, so they want to say, yeah, all facts are fully explained by prior causes. I think it, oh, let me double check. All facts are fully explained by prior causes, except libertarian free choices, right? Those are not fully explained
The
by,
most insane argument
antecedent
of them all.
facts. Yeah, and it's just kind of like, well, there's, there are probably some people, right, who are going to accept that, but it just seems to me like the main reason why they're adopting that view is so they can have a successful contingency argument, right? In other words, that they're just sort of gerrymandering the principle to give them an argument, right? And so what they need to do is show us why we're rationally bound to accept that principle. And what they usually do is try to appeal to these intuitions about, freedom and stuff. And, so, obviously it's going to get sort of complicated, like, to show, I think, why those are kind of like bad arguments, and why libertarian free will is nonsense, you know. Um, but, the starting point is they need to show you why you need to accept this weakened PSR. And it's just not really clear to me how they're going to do that. Like, I mean, how they could have a good argument to establish that principle.
To
Right.
summarize the earlier point, though, to make sure I comprehended what you were saying, there would have to be an explanation
Oh, is that the one?
as to why certain contingent facts are like have a relational existence with their necessaries, and those explanations would have to be necessary facts.
If the strong PSR holds, yeah.
Got it.
All
Okay,
facts will be necessary.
cool. Thanks for explaining all of that, Jack.
Yeah. So I think that the argument is weak. I think that the current way that they want to go, the most prominent defenders of the argument these days, is to try to say that by rejecting even a weak PSR, you're going to be committed to some kind of irrationality. That there's going to be, you're not going to have like an explanation for why it is that, I don't know, like all kinds of brute contingent facts don't occur. Like, why isn't that we aren't seeing, like tigers popping into existence, right? Or pink fairies, or whatever. I think that's like one idea, and I don't know. I think Kuhn's has some argument. I think that has to do with how you'll be committed to some kind of skepticism. I don't remember exactly how it goes. You might want to ask Detroyer. But I mean, I haven't looked at that very closely, but it's always seemed to me to be like kind of silly. Like, everybody admits that there are some brute contingent. Everybody except, like the 6 people that are necessitarians, right, accepts that there are some brute contingencies. So obviously they don't think
Seven
that
people.
brute contingencies. Well, you don't count. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of idiots. There's,
No, that's
Jimmy
fair.
Stevens.
That's,
Jimmy Stevens is a necessitarian. I'm not counting him. Yeah, so I mean, like, other than the 6 people that accept it, everybody accepts there's brute contingencies. So, why is it? So obviously, brute contingency itself is not going to be a threat to these people. Or at least somebody like Kuhn's. I mean, I guess some of the necessitarians will say that they might say that Kuhn's skeptical argument, because Kuhn's is not a necessitarian, right? So he wants to say there's going to be some skepticism you're committed to if you don't accept this weakened principle, right? But presumably some of these like necessitarians, like Della Rocca, might say to Kuhn's, no, look, any brute contingency at all is going to entail skepticism. So your argument that you're trying to run against the people who are rejecting the weak PSR will apply to you as well, But yeah, I don't really remember exactly how those arguments go. So you probably want to ask Detroyer about that.
Wait, now I'm thinking though, in the God analogy, when you said that there would have to be necessary facts about God's desires on the attributes of the universe, is that true? Aren't they just contingent facts, and he came up with a random set of desires, and they were all contingent desires, and they could have been otherwise?
Yeah, most theists are going to say that God's desires are contingent, or at least some of his desires are contingent rather than necessary, such as his desire to create. But problem is, you're still going to have to ask, why is it that that desire holds at this universe?
Do you have to ask that? Can't you just conclude that it could or
Yeah,
it could
because
have not?
on the strong PSR, all facts that are contingent have an explanation. So if it's a contingent fact that God has this desire, then it's going to follow there's some explanation for that fact.
Yeah, and we don't have it.
If we don't have it, then the strong PSR doesn't hold.
Wait, can't there be an explanation without us knowing the explanation?
Oh yeah. It could be that we don't know it, but the point is, it could be that there is an explanation that we don't know it. But then you're just going to be confronted with the same dilemma that I posed before, which is either that further explanation is contingent or it's necessary. If it's contingent, if it's necessary, then it's going to entail what it explains. And if it's contingent, then there's going to be an infinite chain of contingent explanations that has to bottom out in a certain.
Honestly, all of this stuff is pretty hard sometimes. I kind of just want to believe in God again.
All right. Sorry. Sorry, I had to step away for a second. Yeah. So there's just no getting around the dilemma. Oh, that's a good idea. Let me go do that.
Yeah, because if all attributes were then causally explained, all attributes about contingency and necessity, those attributes would cause infinite regress.
Yeah, there's always going to be an infinite regress if a contingent explanation is, if a set of contingent explanations does not bottom out. Are you open yet? Thank you. Does not bottom out in a, sorry, wait, I have to go out of range for a second. I'll be right back.